I remember the moment everything fell apart as clearly as if it were happening right now. We were sitting at a long, polished table, surrounded by the warm hum of conversation and laughter. The dining room glowed with soft light, the kind that made everyone's skin look smooth and perfect, but all I could think about was how stiff Matt looked in his chair. His shoulders hunched just slightly, his gaze firmly planted on the glass of water in front of him. I had begged him to come tonight. It wasn't the first time I'd had to twist his arm about something social, but this one felt important. "They're good people," I had said earlier, trying to mask my irritation. "It's just a casual dinner. You'll like them if you give it a chance." He didn't argue, just gave me that resigned little nod of his, the one that made me feel like I'd already lost some battle I didn't even know we were fighting. When we arrived, Matt did his part, polite smiles, a firm handshake with the host, even a few small comments that could almost pass for enthusiasm. But as the evening stretched on, I could see him retreating into himself, piece by piece. He wasn't shy, not exactly, but he had a way of making himself invisible when he didn't want to be noticed. I, on the other hand, had been trying to make up for his silence all night. Every lull in the conversation felt like an indictment, and I filled it with stories or questions, anything to keep things moving. I laughed a little too loudly at jokes that weren't that funny, leaned forward like I was hanging on every word. It wasn't hard. I'd spent years perfecting this act, but then it started. It was a harmless comment at first. Josh, the host, was recounting a story about a group project from college and how there was always that one guy who barely contributed but still got the grade. His wife chimed in, laughing. "Sounds like Matt in our trivia nights, huh?" The table erupted into laughter. It wasn't cruel, not exactly, but I froze. My eyes darted to Matt, who had finally looked up from his glass. His face was blank, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the stem of his fork. I laughed, too nervously, a little too loud again. "Oh, come on," I said, waving a hand. "He's just a quiet genius, right?" The words felt wrong even as I said them, but it was like my mouth was on autopilot. Matt didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. The evening went on, but the mood had shifted in a way I couldn't quite name. Every laugh felt sharper, every glance in Matt's direction more pointed. And I kept laughing, kept smiling, like I could somehow smooth everything over if I just tried hard enough. The next comment came from Sarah, one of Josh's friends who I barely knew. She'd had a little too much wine and was clearly feeling bold. "Matt, you're so quiet," she exclaimed, tilting her head like she was studying him. "What do you even do for work again?" I bristled. The question was innocent enough, but it was the tone that got under my skin. "He's an analyst," I said quickly before Matt could answer. "Super smart numbers guy. He's always got his head buried in some data." She laughed, a high-pitched, tinkling sound. "Sounds thrilling," she said, and the table laughed again. I felt a rush of heat crawl up my neck. It wasn't just the comment. It was the way they all looked at him, like he was some kind of curiosity, a puzzle they couldn't figure out. And the worst part, he wasn't defending himself. If I were being honest, I'd have to admit that a part of me was angry at him. Why couldn't he just smile, make a joke, do something to break the tension? Why did he always have to be like this, so silent, so stubbornly himself? But beneath the anger, there was something else. Guilt, because the truth was, I had laughed too. Not because I thought it was funny, but because I didn't know what else to do. Because I was too afraid to break the fragile balance of the evening, too afraid to be the one who made things awkward. I glanced at Matt again, hoping for some sign, anything to tell me he wasn't as upset as I feared. But his face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on his plate. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I kept up my performance, laughing, chatting, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was unraveling. Every word, every laugh felt like a betrayal, like I was choosing them over him. And maybe I was. By the time we left, the air between us was so thick I could barely breathe. Matt didn't say a word as we walked to the car. He didn't have to. His silence said everything. The drive home was unbearable. Matt stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that I could see the veins in his forearms. I sat beside him, twisting my wedding ring around my finger, waiting for him to say something, anything. But the silence was relentless, pressing down on me like a weight. I thought about breaking it. A dozen words hovered on the tip of my tongue, but every time I opened my mouth, they evaporated. What could I even say? "I'm sorry" felt hollow, insincere, like it wasn't big enough to cover the damage. They didn't mean it would be worse. Of course, they'd meant it. Every laugh, every jab, every sideways glance, my phone buzzed in my lap. A message from Sarah. "Thanks for coming tonight. You guys are so cute together," smiling face with 3 hearts. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. Cute, like we were some kind of novelty act, a mismatched pair that people could giggle about over dessert. I shoved the phone into my bag, the sound of the zipper startling in the silence. Matt's knuckles flexed on the wheel, and for a second I thought he might speak. Instead, he turned on the blinker, the soft click, click, click filling the void. When we pulled into the driveway, I hesitated. Normally, I'd wait for him to open my door. It was one of those small, old-fashioned gestures he'd always insisted on. But tonight, he didn't move. He sat there, staring straight ahead, the car idling. I opened my own door and stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the yard. I heard his door slam shut behind me, heavy and final, and I winced. Inside, the house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but tense, waiting to explode. I slipped off my shoes and set them neatly by the door, stalling for time. Matt walked past me without a word, heading straight for the kitchen. I followed him, my stomach twisting. He opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter, his back to me. "Matt," I started, my voice too soft, too timid. He didn't turn around. "Matt," I said again, louder this time. He set the bottle down with a deliberate slowness that made my chest tighten. "What?" he said finally, his voice low and controlled. My words faltered. I didn't know how to begin, where to start unraveling the mess I'd made. I didn't mean for tonight to. Didn't mean for what? He turned then, his eyes locking onto mine. They weren't angry exactly, but they were sharp, cutting through me. For them to laugh at me, for you to laugh at me. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "I wasn't laughing at you," I said quickly, too quickly. "I was just what?" His voice rose slightly, the first crack in his calm. "Just going along with it, just trying to keep the peace. Is that what you were doing when they called me a joke?" "They weren't calling you a joke," I protested, even as my voice wavered. "They were just teasing, Matt. That's what people do. It wasn't serious." His laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. "Right, just teasing, and you just stood there laughing along with them because what? It was easier than standing up for me." "That's not fair," I said, heat rising in my chest. "You don't understand what it's like." "What it's like?" He cut me off, his voice incredulous now. "What it's like to sit there and have people mock you while your own wife laughs with them. No, you're right, I don't understand that." "That's not what I meant," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "I was trying to keep things from getting awkward. I didn't want to make it worse." "Well, congratulations," he said, his tone icy. "You didn't make it worse for them, just for me." His words hit like a slap and I stumbled back, my arms wrapping around myself. "I didn't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking. "I was trying to fix it." "You weren't trying to fix anything," he said, shaking his head. "You were trying to save face for you, not for me." "That's not true," I whispered, but the words sounded weak even to my own ears. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, a low, persistent reminder of the mundane life we shared, a life that felt impossibly distant now. Matt ran a hand through his hair, the anger draining from his face, leaving only exhaustion. "You don't get it," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost defeated. "You never have." Before I could respond, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. I stood there, frozen, my mind replaying his words over and over. You don't get it. And maybe he was right. I stayed in the kitchen long after he'd gone upstairs, staring blankly at the counter where his water bottle sat untouched. My mind replayed every second of the dinner, every laugh, every look. Each memory felt like a needle pressing into my skin, sharp and relentless. He was wrong, I told myself. He had to be. I wasn't the villain here. I didn't make those jokes. I didn't ask those people to treat him like some kind of joke. All I'd done was try to survive the evening, try to keep things light, try to make sure everyone else was comfortable. That wasn't a crime, was it? And yet, his words clung to me like burrs. You don't get it. What didn't I get? That he didn't like being teased? Of course I knew that. But everyone gets teased sometimes. That's just how people are. It doesn't mean anything. It wasn't like they were trying to hurt him. They didn't even know him well enough for it to be personal. I swallowed hard, pushing back the wave of guilt that was rising in my chest. I wasn't ready to deal with that yet. Instead, I busied myself with small, pointless tasks, wiping down the counter, straightening the already aligned chairs, folding the dish towel over the handle of the oven. But no matter how much I moved, no matter how many little distractions I created, the silence of the house pressed down on me like a weight. I thought about going upstairs, about saying something, anything to make things right. But what would I even say? That I was sorry, that I didn't mean to hurt him. I'd already tried that, and it had only made things worse. I paced the kitchen, chewing on the inside of my cheek. Maybe he just needed time to cool off. That's how Matt was. He'd retreat, stew for a while, and eventually come back when he was ready. That's what I told myself anyway. But deep down, I wasn't so sure this time. Eventually, I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs. Our bedroom door was closed, and the light seeping through the crack at the bottom told me he was still awake. I paused outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I pushed it open. Matt was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He didn't look up when I walked in. His shoulders were hunched, his body tense, like he was holding something inside that he didn't want me to see. "Hey," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. I stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do. The room felt too small, the air too heavy. I took a hesitant step forward. "Matt, can we talk?" "I don't think there's anything left to say," he said, his voice flat. "There is," I insisted, even though I wasn't sure what it was. I sat down beside him, leaving a careful amount of space between us. "I need you to understand I wasn't trying to hurt you tonight. I really wasn't." "I know," he said, his tone still unreadable. "That's what makes it worse." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He finally looked up at me, his eyes tired and sad. "You don't even realize what you did, do you? You laughed with them. You let them tear me down and you didn't say a word. And now you're sitting here trying to convince me it wasn't a big deal." "It wasn't like that," I said quickly. "I was trying to keep things from getting awkward, that's all." I wasn't agreeing with them. "But you didn't stop them either," he interrupted. "You didn't defend me. You didn't say, 'Hey, that's enough,' or 'He's not like that.' You just let it happen." His words hit like a blow, and I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out, because he was right. I hadn't done any of those things. I'd sat there and laughed, hoping it would all blow over, hoping no one would notice how uncomfortable I was. "I didn't know what to do," I said finally, my voice small. "You didn't have to do anything," he said. "Just not laughing would have been enough, just being on my side for once." "I am on your side," I protested. "Then why didn't it feel like it?" he asked, his voice breaking just slightly. I had no answer for that. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Matt stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. "Do you know how it feels to sit there and have people pick you apart like that? To feel like the punchline of some joke you don't even understand?" I looked down at my hands, my throat tight. "No," I admitted. "Well, I do," he said, his voice heavy. "And the worst part wasn't them. It was you." Those words shattered something inside me. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I wasn't like them, that I hadn't meant to hurt him. But all I could do was sit there, the weight of his disappointment pressing down on me like a stone. When he finally turned back to face me, there was no anger left in his expression, only exhaustion. "I'm going to sleep," he said quietly. "You can stay if you want, but I don't think there's anything left to say tonight." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes, and watched as he climbed into bed, turning his back to me. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the floor, wondering if I'd just lost something I didn't know how to fix. The night stretched on in unbearable stillness. I sat in the dark, the weight of his words looping through my mind like a broken record. The worst part wasn't them. It was you. I couldn't escape it, couldn't reason my way out of the truth in what he'd said. I had laughed. I had chosen them, chosen comfort, politeness, and appearance over him. And now he lay there in the same room but felt miles away, his back to me, his breath slow and measured. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the scene play out again. The laughter at the table, the tightness in Matt's jaw, the way he'd withdrawn further and further into himself. I thought about the times he'd told me he hated being the center of attention, how I'd brushed it off as an overreaction. He wasn't shy, he just didn't like being vulnerable in front of people. And tonight, I had let those people expose him, mock him, while I smiled along like it didn't matter. I finally stood and left the room, unable to stay in that suffocating silence. The house felt cavernous and cold as I wandered into the living room and collapsed onto the couch. I pulled a blanket over my shoulders and stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I wanted to tell myself this was just a fight, something we'd get past like we always did. But it didn't feel that way. It felt bigger, heavier, like something had shifted between us in a way I couldn't undo. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a message from Josh. "Great seeing you both tonight. Let's do it again soon." The audacity of it made my stomach turn. I stared at the message, my hand trembling as I hovered over the keyboard. What I wanted to say was something cutting, something to make him understand what his little jokes had done. But instead, I deleted the reply and set the phone down. I buried my face in my hands, guilt clawing at my chest. Was Matt right? Did I care more about what these people thought of me than I cared about him? The thought made me sick. I tried to think back to the version of me that Matt had fallen in love with. The woman he'd married wasn't someone who laughed at his expense. She wasn't someone who let others tear him down. She had been fiercely protective of him, of the quiet strength he carried, of the way he saw the world differently than anyone else. When had I stopped being that woman? I thought about our first date, the way Matt had spent most of it listening, letting me ramble nervously while he quietly observed. I had liked that about him, that he didn't feel the need to fill every silence. He was thoughtful, deliberate. He didn't waste words, but over the years I'd started to see his silence as something else, an inconvenience, a flaw, something I needed to smooth over or apologize for in social situations. Tears welled in my eyes as the realization hit me. I wasn't angry at Matt for being distant tonight. I was angry at myself for not protecting him. I had failed him and I wasn't sure if I could fix it. The sound of the bedroom door opening startled me. I turned to see Matt standing in the doorway, his face half hidden in the dim light. "I couldn't sleep," he said simply, his voice soft. Neither could I. He walked over to the couch and sat down on the other end, leaving a careful distance between us. For a moment we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. "Matt," I began, my voice breaking, "I messed up tonight, I know I did." He didn't respond, but he didn't get up and leave either. That was something. "I shouldn't have laughed," I continued, my hands twisting in my lap. "I shouldn't have let them say those things. I don't know why I did. I guess I thought it was easier to just go along with it, but it wasn't. It wasn't easier, not for you and not for me either." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his face still unreadable. "Do you know how it feels?" He asked finally, his voice low. "To sit there and feel like you're completely alone, like the one person who's supposed to have your back doesn't even see you." I felt a fresh wave of tears spill over. "I see you," I said desperately. "Matt, I see you. I let you down tonight and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." For the first time since we'd left that dinner, he turned to look at me. His eyes weren't as cold as they had been earlier, but there was still so much hurt in them that it made my chest ache. "Sorry doesn't fix this," he said softly. "I know," I whispered. "But I want to fix it. I don't know how, but I'll do whatever it takes. I need you to know that I'm on your side, Matt. I've always been on your side." He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Then prove it," he said. I nodded, wiping at my eyes. "I will." The silence stretched out again, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, and for now that was enough. The next morning, the house was quiet in a way that felt fragile, as though the wrong movement or word might shatter whatever tentative truce we'd reached the night before. Matt was already awake when I came downstairs, standing by the window with a mug of coffee in his hands. He was looking out into the backyard, the soft morning light catching in his hair, and for a moment he didn't notice me there. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to disturb him. Part of me wanted to retreat, to give him the space he clearly needed, but I knew that wasn't the answer. Not anymore. "Morning," I said finally, my voice soft. He turned slightly, acknowledging me with a small nod but said nothing. His expression was calm but not warm. "I made coffee," he said after a moment, his voice neutral. There's some left in the pot. I murmured a quiet thanks and poured myself a cup, the simple domesticity of the act feeling out of place against the tension that still lingered. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved, though he didn't say anything else. Finally, I couldn't take the silence any longer. Matt, I began, setting my mug down and turning to face him. About last night, do we really have to do this right now? He interrupted, his tone weary. Yes, I said firmly, surprising even myself. We do. Because if we don't, it's just going to hang over us and I can't stand that. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. What do you want me to say? I don't want you to say anything, I said quickly. I want to say something, I need to. I spent all night thinking about what happened and I realized I've been failing you for a long time. He looked at me then, his expression cautious but curious. I've been so caught up in what other people think of us, of me, that I haven't been paying attention to how it makes you feel, I continued, my words tumbling out in a rush. I tell myself I'm just trying to keep the peace or make things easier, but that's not true. The truth is, I've been selfish. And last night, I let that selfishness hurt you. He didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Finally, he set his mug down on the windowsill and turned to face me fully. Why now? He asked quietly. Why is this suddenly so important to you? Because I saw what I was doing to you, I said, my voice trembling. And I hated it. I hated the way you looked at me, like I wasn't someone you could trust. I don't ever want to see that look on your face again. His jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms over his chest. It's not that simple, you know. You can't just say you're sorry and expect everything to go back to normal. I know, I said quickly. I'm not asking for that. I want you to know that I'm going to do better. I'm going to stand up for you even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, because you deserve that. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. You say that now, he said finally. But what happens the next time we're in a room full of people who think it's funny to tear me down? Are you really going to stand up for me then, or are you just going to laugh along like you always do? The question hit me like a slap, and I felt a fresh wave of shame rise in my chest. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I'm going to try, and if I mess up again, I'll keep trying. Because you're worth it, Matt. You're worth everything. His expression softened just slightly, the faintest crack in the wall he'd built around himself. I don't know if I believe you yet, he said honestly. I don't blame you, I said, but I'm going to show you, I promise. For a moment, we just stood there, the morning light casting long shadows across the room. Finally, Matt nodded, a small, hesitant gesture, but it was enough to make my chest ache with relief. Okay, he said quietly. We'll see. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a step, and for now, that was all I could ask for. The following week felt like walking on a tightrope stretched over a canyon. I was hyper-aware of everything, of Matt's silences, of his small, cautious responses when I spoke, of the way he watched me as though waiting for me to stumble. I couldn't blame him. I had earned his doubt, and undoing it would take more than just promises. I started with the little things. I stopped brushing past him in conversations or making assumptions about what he wanted. Instead, I asked. I listened. I gave him space when he needed it, but I also made sure he knew I was there. It felt clumsy and awkward, like learning how to walk all over again, but I was determined not to fall back into old habits. The real test came on Friday when Josh called. We're thinking of getting together again this weekend, he said, his tone breezy as though nothing had happened. You and Matt should come. My stomach twisted at the thought. The last thing I wanted was to put Matt through another night like the last one, but I also knew what he'd say if I told him about the invitation. He'd insist we go, that it was fine, that he didn't care, but I knew he did care. Actually, I said carefully, I think we're going to sit this one out. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Josh's confusion. Everything okay? He asked. Yeah, I said quickly. We're just taking some time for ourselves this weekend. Josh laughed a little awkwardly. Well, all right, let me know if you change your mind. I hung up, my heart pounding. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental. For once, I wasn't putting someone else's comfort ahead of Matt's. When he came home that evening, I told him about the call. Josh invited us over, I said casually as I set the table. But I told him we weren't coming. Matt looked up from his bag, his expression unreadable. Why? Because I didn't want to put you through that again, I said simply. And honestly, I didn't want to go either. Not if it's going to be like last time. He stared at me for a long moment, as though trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. I know, I said, but I wanted to. He nodded slowly, a hint of something softer flickering in his eyes before he looked away. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me hope. The weekend passed quietly, just the two of us. We went for a hike on Saturday, something we hadn't done in months, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw Matt smile. It wasn't the hesitant, guarded smile he'd been giving me all week. It was real, unfiltered, and it made my chest ache with both relief and guilt. As we sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley below, I turned to him, my heart hammering in my chest. Matt, can I ask you something? He glanced at me, his expression cautious but open. Sure. Why didn't you just tell me before, about how much it bothered you, I mean? He looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I guess I thought you knew, he said after a moment. And if you didn't, maybe it was because you didn't want to. The words stung, but I knew he wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just being honest. I didn't know, I said softly. But that's not an excuse. I should have paid more attention. I should have cared enough to notice. He didn't respond right away, and I wondered if I'd said too much, pushed too hard. But then he sighed and turned back to me, his eyes meeting mine. I'm not good at saying what I need, he admitted. I never have been, but that doesn't mean I don't need it. His vulnerability hit me like a wave, and I reached out, taking his hand in mine. I hear you, I said quietly, and I promise I'll do better, not just now, but always. He nodded, squeezing my hand briefly before letting go. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered, settling into the space between us like a quiet understanding. As we walked back down the trail, the sun setting behind us, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The following weeks unfolded slowly, like an old wound trying to heal. Every day brought its challenges, but I clung to the small victories. A shared laugh, a lingering touch, the moments when Matt looked at me without that guarded distance in his eyes. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way he paused before speaking, as if weighing his words carefully, and how easily I used to cut him off. The way he'd sit quietly at the edge of a conversation, his presence unassuming but steady, while I felt the need to fill every silence. It wasn't just the big moments I needed to fix. It was the accumulation of these little ones. I had spent years overlooking them, and now they felt glaringly obvious, like lights flashing on a warning sign I'd ignored for far too long. One evening, Matt came home later than usual. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner when I heard the door creak open. Hey, I called out. Long day? He didn't answer right away, which made me glance up. He was standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, his shoulders slumped. You okay? I asked, setting the knife down. He hesitated, then nodded, but it was clear something was bothering him. I wiped my hands on a towel and crossed the room to him. Matt, talk to me, I said softly. What's going on? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I saw Josh today, he admitted. At lunch. My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice calm. What happened? Nothing, really. He asked how we were, said he hadn't seen us in a while, and then, he trailed off, his expression hardening. And then, I prompted gently. And then he made a joke, Matt said, his voice tinged with bitterness. About how he'd better not get on my bad side or I might snap again. Like it was some kind of punchline. I felt anger bubble up in my chest, hot and sharp. That's not okay, I said firmly. He had no right to say that. Matt shrugged, but his eyes betrayed his hurt. It doesn't matter, he muttered. It's just who he is. It does matter, I said, my voice rising. It matters because you matter, Matt. You shouldn't have to put up with that from anyone, least of all someone who calls themselves a friend. He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. You didn't think that before, he said quietly. The words stung, but I didn't flinch. You're right, I said. I didn't, and I hate that, but I see it now, and I'm not going to let it slide anymore. Not with him, not with anyone. He studied me for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether he believed me. So what are you going to do? He asked finally. I'm going to talk to him, I said without hesitation. And I'm going to tell him that if he wants to stay in our lives, He needs to show you the respect you deserve." Matt raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "You think that'll work?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I have to try, because I'm done letting people treat you like that, and I'm done being one of those people." His gaze softened, and for the first time that night I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen in weeks: trust. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's see what happens." The next day, I called Josh. When he answered, his voice was as cheerful and oblivious as ever. "Hey, stranger," he said. "What's up?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "We need to talk," I said firmly. "About last night and about Matt." The conversation that followed was tense and uncomfortable, but I didn't back down. I told him how his words had hurt Matt, how his jokes weren't funny, and how they had contributed to the tension in our marriage. I told him that if he wanted to remain a part of our lives, he needed to do better. To my surprise, Josh actually listened. He apologized, awkwardly but sincerely, and promised to be more mindful in the future. When I told Matt about the conversation that evening, he seemed genuinely surprised. "You really did that?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "I told you I would," I said simply. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he said softly. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like we were on the same side again. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds that needed time to heal, still moments when I caught myself falling into old patterns, but it was progress. And as I sat beside Matt that evening, our hands brushing against each other in the quiet comfort of our living room, I realized that progress was enough. For now, it was enough. A month passed, and slowly, life began to feel less heavy. Matt and I weren't just coexisting anymore. We were rebuilding. It wasn't without effort. There were moments when the old habits tried to creep back in, when I had to stop myself from saying something dismissive or ignoring a subtle cue from him. But each time, I caught myself, corrected it, and watched as Matt's trust in me grew. Josh kept his word, too. The next time we saw him at a casual group dinner, he was noticeably more careful with his words. He made an effort to include Matt in the conversation, asking him about his work and listening without interrupting or cracking a joke. It was awkward at first, like watching someone try to navigate a language they barely knew, but it was a start. I wasn't sure if Matt noticed, but I did. After dinner, as we walked back to the car, I looked over at Matt. "How did you feel about tonight?" I asked. He shrugged, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "It was fine," he said, then added, "Better, I guess." "Better is good," I said softly. He glanced at me, a faint smile on his lips. "Yeah, it is." The small moments of progress began to add up. We started spending more time together, not just physically, but emotionally. Matt began to share more of himself with me, things he'd been holding back for years. I learned about the pressure he felt to always be the calm one, the easygoing one, even when it hurt. "I think I just got used to people assuming I didn't care," he said one night as we sat on the couch, the TV flickering in the background. "But it's not true. I care a lot. I just didn't think it mattered enough to say it." I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "It matters to me," I said, "and it always will." But there were still moments of tension, moments when I could see the shadow of the past lingering between us. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the closet, I found an old photo of us at a party years ago. We were both smiling, carefree, with no idea of what was coming. I showed it to Matt when he came home that evening, my chest tight with nostalgia. "Do you remember this night?" I asked, handing him the photo. He looked at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said finally, "I do. Things were easier then, weren't they?" I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Maybe," he said, setting the photo down on the table. "Or maybe we just weren't paying attention to the cracks yet." His words stung, but I couldn't argue with them. He was right. "I don't want to go back to pretending things are perfect," I said after a moment. "I want us to be better than that." Matt nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "Me too." It wasn't the sentimental response I'd been hoping for, but it was honest. And that honesty was something we'd been missing for far too long. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself growing more confident in our relationship. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something stronger, something more real. I started to trust myself again, to believe that I could be the partner Matt deserved. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set, Matt turned to me and said something that caught me off guard. You know, he began, his voice soft. For a long time, I didn't think you'd ever really see me, not the way I wanted you to. His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Matt, but you do now, he said, cutting me off gently. And that means more to me than I can explain. I didn't know what to say, so I just reached for his hand, holding it tightly in mine. In that moment, I realized that while we still had a long way to go, we were heading in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly in it together. The past wasn't erased, but it didn't have to define us. We were writing a new story, one that was messy and imperfect but ours. And that was enough. A few more months passed, and while things between Matt and I had settled into a rhythm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still holding my breath, waiting for something to go wrong. I wasn't sure if I was expecting the past to repeat itself, or if I just wasn't ready to trust that this fragile peace would last. We'd had our fair share of challenges, of course. Matt had moments of withdrawing, of retreating back into the quiet, reserved version of himself that he'd been for so long. And I, in turn, had moments of frustration, of wanting him to open up more, to trust me completely. But there was a difference now, a shift that had slowly worked its way into our marriage. We were talking about it. One evening, as we were sitting in bed, reading our books in companionable silence, Matt spoke up. I don't think I've ever really told you how much it means to me that you've been doing this, he said, not looking up from his book. You know, trying, after everything. I glanced over at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. What do you mean? Trying to fix things, trying to make it right. I set my book aside and propped myself up on my elbow, looking at him intently. Matt, I told you I would, I said softly. I meant it. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. I don't think I understood before how hard that would be for you, he said quietly. How much of yourself you had to change. I frowned, not entirely sure what he meant. I haven't changed who I am. I've just stopped ignoring the parts of me that weren't helping us. He nodded slowly, as though processing my words. I guess what I'm saying is I've been waiting for you to stop, to go back to how things used to be, how we used to be. I felt my stomach tighten at his words, but I forced myself to stay calm. I can't go back, I said quietly, and I don't want to. He studied me for a long moment before his gaze softened. I know. But sometimes I wonder if I'm holding you back, if the things I need are too much for you to give. I felt a lump form in my throat, and I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his. You're not holding me back, Matt, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I want to give you what you need. I just need you to trust me when I say I'm doing my best. We're both learning. I'm not perfect, and neither are you. But we're here, and that's what matters. There was a long pause before he spoke again. I know, I don't want to lose you. My heart ached at his words, and I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his. You won't, I whispered. Not unless we let each other go, and I'm not letting go. For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of our conversation hanging between us. I wasn't sure if he believed me, but I believed it with all my heart. Later that night, as I lay in bed next to him, I realized that the fear I'd been carrying with me had softened. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. I still had moments of doubt, of wondering if we could really rebuild something from the wreckage of what had been, but those moments didn't define us anymore. We were building, piece by piece, learning how to trust again. I thought about all the times I had dismissed his feelings in the past, how I had allowed myself to believe that my way was the only way. And I thought about how far we had come since then. I had made mistakes, and I knew I would make more, but I wasn't the same person I was when all of this began. I was starting to see that growth wasn't about perfection. It was about the effort to change, the willingness to try, even when it felt easier to give up. And as I closed my eyes that night, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for us after all. Not in some fairy tale way, but in the quiet, imperfect way that real love works. And that was enough. Thank you for following along with this journey of growth, trust, and rebuilding a relationship. If you've found yourself relating to the challenges and emotional depth in this story, take a moment to reflect on your own relationships. How can you show more understanding, more patience, and more willingness to grow together? Relationships take work, but they also offer a chance for healing and transformation. Keep putting in the effort, even when the road is tough.